All righty. Hello, friends. Welcome. We are going to get started. Welcome to PBS Wisconsin Education's Educator Connection Live. This month's topic is planning a culturally relevant Day of the Dead celebration with our lovely guest speaker, Araceli. My name is mouna.algahaithi, and I am the Education Engagement Specialist with PBS Wisconsin, and I will be moderating this webinar today. You are welcome to use the chat box to introduce yourselves. I invite you throughout our discussion today to add any comments or questions that you have to the chat box, and we'll be sure to make sure that you get a response to those. I just want to set up a couple guidelines for our webinar today. And I ask that during this conversation today, we all embody these three community guidelines: that we practice empathy and practice respect for cultures and values and beliefs that may be different than our own, and that we center our own learning and recognize that we are all entering the space with our own values and backgrounds and experiences. And lastly, please be open to new ideas. Before we get started, I just wanted to share that PBS Wisconsin is committed to utilizing our platform to being an ally in the fight against racial injustice and for social justice. PBS Wisconsin believes that there is no place for racism in our society, and that we as a system, as an institution, have a responsibility to use our voice and privilege to act. We have a responsibility to continue to educate ourselves in our communities of the injustices that happen against Black and Brown students. We have a responsibility to acknowledge and face our own biases continuously. And we have a responsibility to keep this conversation and conversations like these going forward. And so we thank you for being with us today. With that said, I am going to pass the mic to our wonderful guest speaker. Araceli, please introduce yourself, and I will stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours.
Hello everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction and creating that space and acknowledging those things acknowledging anti-racism and in what PBS wants to do. I think it's so fundamental to a lot of why I'm here today. So I will share my screen as well. And hope you guys can see this. This is kind of new for me, at least, to utilize Google Slides over Zoom versus something else. So it kind of might look a little bit cut off here. Not sure how to fix that, but we'll move on. Again, my name is Araceli Esparza. I am a Chicana Latina teaching artist. And my background is that I have a master's in children's literature from Hamline University. I'm a picture book writer and a poet and a business owner as well. So I've done a couple of things in the world, but I really enjoy my time with children and as a visiting teaching artist. So oftentimes I'll teach poetry writing classes. I'll teach on Dia De Los Muertos, Dia De Los Niños, and I bring many different things to the classrooms. We make altars, sometimes we'll make food. So it just really depends. So over the years, this has grown into something that I didn't expect perhaps, but it chose me. And what chose me were, just the stories, like this one, like Marisol McDonald doesn't match. She's this Scottish Ecuadorian child. And throughout the book, we see all these differences that she has, and yet she wants to bring them all together. And so I feel like this is a little bit of what this journey and this conversation that we're having together will be like. We're going to have a lot of different things that we'll look at. And how do they come together? They don't always have to match, but we should be joyful in that as well, because the process of getting all those things, it's like where the heart is, right? And so my art about teaching children is that things don't need to match. Things can be kind of just like juxtaposed, but yet as long as we accept them and embrace them, it's okay. So I wanted us to take a little bit of time, perhaps in the chat, about what is your heart about teaching children? Like, if your heart could speak about teaching children, what would it say? And I'll let you guys like go into the chat and see if I can see the chat too. I have to maybe bring down, I'm not sure if I'll be able to see it because I'm sharing my screen, but
Araceli, I will read whatever people write in the chat for you, okay?
okay, perfect. So just giving you guys a little bit of chance there to think about that, thinking about if your heart could speak, what would it say about teaching for children? My heart speaks about the rise of the guardians. I oftentimes love to think about just that magicalism, the magical realism that we can learn so much from these stories that invoke magic, invoke powers over, right? Powers that help us navigate the challenges of life. And I think that's the type of heart we need to come to when we're thinking about centering these traditions. So my traditions come from, I'm proudly raised by immigrants. My parents came from Guanajuato, Mexico, as migrant workers, and throughout the years we've been here since the early 70s, and landed all the way up here in Wisconsin because of migrant working and tending the fields. And so from there, I just, I went to the university, went to my undergrad studies, but just really was very attracted to visual representation. Visual communications was really big for me as growing up. So imagine being also part of Day of the Dead and encountering my first Day of the Dead in Mexico. It was just so impactful for me. Just the colors, all the traditions, the makeup, all of these different things were very impactful. And I wouldn't see that necessarily here in the United States. So for many years, I think up until very recently, right, in the last 15 years, we haven't seen Day of the Dead was very much considered. It was internationally known, but also not recognized so much in the United States. And
Araceli,
now,
oh,
uh-huh,
sorry. I was going to share some of the comments. Is now a good
yes,
time?
yes, that would be perfect.
Okay, so we have a couple of responses. One of them says, my heart about working with children is to be the kind of adult I needed as a child.
Mm,
Another says, heart is warm, seeing students empowered, seeing students' experiences, beauty and joy, as well as learning to navigate conflict in a way that is safe and confident. And then
mm.
lastly, someone shared that my heart is for freedom and empowerment of students. Thank you all so much for sharing.
Thank you all so much for sharing. So this event was very much about that. I have been giving these type of presentations for the last 6 years, and then at Midvale Elementary, Flora Mitchell invited not me, just but like I think 20 some of us, different Latinos around the city, from various different walks of life, from parents to uh, police officers to teaching artists like myself. We were all invited to spend a couple hours with various different students throughout Midvale. And so so when we were talking about the heart, that is exactly what we try to create with Day of the Dead for us. And what will we cover today is these two Latinx holidays and how we tie them into the classroom. Okay, so there's some questions here for us to think about prior to even entering this. And we know that we want to invoke heart and empowerment to our students. But see, these are some questions that we would need to ask ourselves. And this comes from me doing this again for so many years. And there's just different stories I'll tell you throughout this hour that made me want to have these questions up for you, especially why is it important to talk about death in the classroom? So wanting to think about that right away, and seeing whether or not this is the right holiday for us to explore. Why is it in the US not a good thing to talk about that? And thinking about how we're going to adapt that to our age group that we're teaching. And can you name how you have talked about death in the classroom? So if you haven't already, I would suggest, if this is going to be a holiday that we talk about, that has already been talked about. And I say this because I've taught this in 4K all the way up to I think sophomores. Yeah, sophomores are my oldest. And I had to adapt the lesson to that age group, dependent on those questions that I had to ask myself and ask the teachers before we would enter into that space. But here's my favorite part of Day of the Dead is like learning to say the words, right? So I wouldn't be a teacher if I wouldn't tell you guys how to say the words. So I know I can't hear you, but in your in your houses, we're gonna go through let's say them all phonetically here. Okay, so the first one is Dia de los Muertos. So that O is very long and the R is pretty sharp there. Calaveras, calaveras. So it's all of it, you know, it's all every vowel there is pretty much heard. And those are the skulls. Papel picado. Papel picado. And that's the paper cutouts, right, for Day of the Dead. And then cempasúchil. Cempasúchil are the marigolds. Pan de muerto, and that's the Day of the Dead bread. And I'm so sorry. I wanted to show you guys more examples of this, and I apologize that was not able to do that today. But let's move on to what is the altar. So the altar or the altar is the main piece of the ofrenda. So the ofrenda is the whole area that we're taking up for the altar. So that's the whole space. Now the altar has 3 levels: sky, earth, and the underworld. And this relates to the Aztec belief system, right? So nowadays it might be, there's going to be it might be interpreted differently, but this all comes from those 3 levels. So your altar should have 3 levels to it. And there's other special elements that should be part of it as well. And those things you can also Google too. We won't go into deeply into this, except for wanting to just show you guys kind of like what is all part of Day of the Dead. So an ofrenda is a home altar with a collection of objects, right? And so these objects, as you can see here, so it can be food, representations. The calaveras are here. The papel picado, you can see those in little streamers there. Marigold flowers, essences like frankincense, anything that's going to be really fragrant. And you'll see oranges, bananas are there. So we want fruit, right? We want this to be organic. Oh my gosh, some of the food can be, oh, it's just so tempting. It's so tempting. And we'll talk about how we tie this ofrenda and like even the food, we'll tie that into the classroom. So we can really spend a lot of time just looking at this ofrenda and like coming up with activities, coming up with extensions of learning there. Papel picado, pictures of the beloved ones who have passed, the candles, the water, the banquet, the flowers, and the sugar skulls you can see there. And another part of it, we'll just go right here, calaveras, the skulls, right? The little sugar skulls. Now, some of these can be made, I've seen different representations, and I'll show you guys that soon, of how we can make this, I mean, not so labor intensive. The sugar skulls are very labor intensive to make. I have made them with the children. It does take about 2 to 3 days. It's not so much, it's a messy process, but certainly after they are dry, they're really good proof. Like you can't eat them, but do not eat them. But certainly they're really foolproof. So the papel picado is the paper cut. And I use this picture because I already had the marigolds, the cempasúchil, pan de muerto, right? The Day of the Dead bread. As you can see, I'm also using it as my screensaver, as my virtual background today. My favorite part, though, I really love is the pan de muerto. Homemade is always the best. And remembering the people who have lost. So it is celebrated on November 1st and November 2nd. It does coincide with the Catholic holiday, All Souls Day and All Saints Day. But it was combined from like the indigenous peoples of Mexico and their own traditions. So it's being celebrated on both fronts in Mexico. There'll be celebrations that are in the church, and there'll be celebrations that are in the community, and celebrations that will take it home and in graveyard sites too. So we'll talk a little bit here about the altar symbolisms. And again, this is just background, but it's still I think very important and fun to be, and I think it will also tie you into making sure that these things are part of the next altar that you have, so that so that it's authentic. It can be slanted. It doesn't necessarily need to be sugar skulls. There's all kinds of paper skulls, and we'll learn about those in a second too, of other types of ways of making skulls. Marigolds, this, it's believed that the scent of the bright orange blooms help to attract the souls to the altar. So that's really important to think about like how the marigolds play into this, right? And you can use that, again, can be another activity. What kind of things can we make to lead to the altar? And it's also supposed to smell nice. So I think that it really invokes all the senses. Papel picado, we can make those too with the children as well. This, but it's also, the symbol is of the fragility of life. So I thought that was really interesting background for Dia de los Muertos. And the way I've connected Dia de los Muertos through self. And I really didn't even understand that I was doing self until I learned what SEL meant. And how I've done this is like the social awareness, right? Understanding your emotions and your thoughts around death, around their dearly departed. So we oftentimes in the classroom, I'll come in and we'll have a circle, we'll do it on the carpet or circle, or push the chairs and tables, right? To form that. That is probably the best way of doing that. I have done it in auditoriums, and we'll talk about that a little bit too, but I found it more intimate and able to engage that self-awareness. And also it's great for self-management, having this done in a classroom versus another place like a gym or something. It can be done, but it's much more better, I thought, and through my experiences, was better in a classroom because of the self-awareness. So what I would do is, once I have the altar and the ofrenda, we would use post-its to draw their calaveritas, and they would post it on the altar or the chalkboard. The calaverita is a small sugar skull. We've seen those pictures already. And how do we show responsible decision making? So the responsible decision making was during circle time and sharing about who was our dearly departed, was whether or not we could stay, depending on the age group, could we stay still, could respond, and how do we respond? Well, we're talking about death. We need to, and I think this is a one time, I think, in teaching in classes, so one time you can be like, you can put the stops on people's interruptions, because this is a sacred moment. And it almost doesn't need to be said. And that's been the nice experience of when I'm working with students, is that we all understand what loss is, right? It could be pets, it could be grandparents. And what I've enjoyed is learning about even people that they never met, but their mother or their aunt has talked so much about this grandfather or this great uncle, this grandmother, so many times that this child knows this person, even though they never met them. And I think that is the magic of Dia de los Muertos, is the idea that they will come back for this day. And I said, well, write their name, write their name, and let's put them on the altar so that they'll have somewhere to come back and you'll remember them. And that way we all know about them, is kind of like what I would tell people. And again, this is more geared towards, what I'm talking to you guys about is more geared towards up to 5th grade. Middle schoolers and high schoolers, very different. My approach is very different. It's more historical, or we would do other jokes, but we'll talk about that later. SEL, I think, is so well managed in primary school, and that's where I see a lot of the magic for them. So they can separate the altar, so making duties of groups of students, either doing papel picado or the calaveras, but also taking it apart and putting it back in, so we have different teamworks, and that reflects the self-management and relationship skills that they can build, all out of one holiday. So it is a holiday that I feel is just invokes so much community, right? It invokes so much community and opportunities for extended learning there. Do you have any questions? Because that's a lot of information. And Mona, just go ahead and if you guys want to, just put them in the chat, any questions that you might have.
I'll read them out if any come up, okay?
Okay, for sure. Yeah, I know that's a lot of information, and we're now gonna break it down for you guys for the activities. So I've been talking about how to make some of these things work for your classroom. And prior to this class, prior to my class last yesterday, I put it on. I was putting it on my social, right, my social media, and somebody said, "Oh, I so miss having Dia de los Muertos because I get to eat and we get to the champurrado." I'm sorry, I didn't go into the hot chocolate Mexican mix that you should have every Dia de los Muertos. If you're so lucky to have a family that can make it for you, or a Mexican bakery that's nearby that you can maybe order from. But Mexican champurrado, which is Mexican hot chocolate, goes so well with that pan de muertos. And so we were just talking about those times when we could not. We're not with COVID right now. So how can we make these activities even in virtual learning? So we'll talk a little bit about that here today as well. So edible marshmallow skulls. I know. They're just so adorable. So easy to make these jumbo marshmallows, and then you just get edible markers and you just put them on a straw. We've used bamboo sticks. The whole project, I think, maybe costs less than $10, maybe 12. And I've done this with like kids of like 30 or some more. So that's a nice, and it's also something that can maybe be done at home possibly as well. You can take you can send kids diagrams of sugar skull templates. They can print those out, or maybe even have them printed out for them, and when they do their supply pickups they could pick them up. Show them videos of how to do some paper miracles as well, and that could be something that parents could do with their kids virtually. And I know that some of the supplies might not be there. This one in particular, though, just scissors and like a little bit of string. So one thing I had thought too is that I'll tell you guys a little story of how I came up with the shoebox altar. I went around to the shoe stores, and they have so many extra shoe boxes, and so I think I did this like for maybe 3 years in a row at the library, and we just would do shoebox altars. And as you can see, these do not have to be intricate. They're just super simple. Doritos, right? A Butterfinger. Of course they love Butterfingers. And I love this picture of this particular altar because it to me is just home. That's home. That's Nana, that's Tata. It's just home. It's very simple. It doesn't need to be intricate. And I love leading with these type of pictures so that the kids don't already have this misconception of like it needs to be something very intricate. They've probably seen a lot of them already that are really over the top, itsy. But yes, so before we move on, we move on, so I wanted just to talk a little bit about the reading that I do for Day of the Dead. And so that's my next slide, is the books, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I want to talk a little bit about what I look for in good books for Day of the Dead. Okay, I look for things that have rhyme, especially when I'm doing the primary, but even the older kids, if you a little bit, you could even just as a joke have it as them reading it, if they're middle graders or high schoolers, they'll still read it because it has a rhyme to it, right? I look for things that have history, that has history to the monarch butterfly, which has another angle of teaching this Day of the Dead, is because the monarch there's a whole legend about the monarch butterfly and Day of the Dead. So I won't go into it today, but there are books about that too. I look for Spanish words in this book. I'll make sure that there's Latinx kids that are represented in these books as well. And humor, the acknowledgement of sadness. And when I say the acknowledgement of sadness, if you remembered when we were looking at Marisol McDonald's picture, and there was even a sad picture of her face. I think it's important to talk about a little bit about the sadness of Day of the Dead, and it can't always just be, there should be like a sentence or two about that. So those are some things that I look for. The bad ones, confusion with trick-or-treating, no mentioning of visiting the gravesite because that is intricate to Dia de los Muertos. The focus is on face painting or only the skulls. So I've seen that a lot, is like the face painting and the skulls. And I just, I've seen our teachers, and a lot of us make those mistakes too. But that's that's for some other time. That's for when you're doing the festival and you're actually going to the graveside. So, uh, I think it confuses too much with Halloween, and this isn't that. So Halloween is about scaring the spirits, and Dia de los Muertos is about inviting them in and honoring the ones that we really know. And it's more about family who has passed and like pets and people who are dear to us. So no real story, but the focus is on candy is another earmarker of mine if when I'm looking for good books to share with children. So moving on, and let me know if there's any more questions.
None so far. You're doing a great job.
Okay. No, thank you. Thank you all. So one thing that when I come into, when I'm entering the classroom, who am I? Especially as a teaching artist and being Latina, I'm a parent. I'm also an student of a product of institutionalized racism. My work and my education, all these things come into me when I'm coming into a class. But some things are, but what is missing sometimes, I feel, is that we don't welcome all of the parts of a teaching of anybody who's visiting the classroom. And oftentimes we teach the children, you know, these we teach them these things about like things that are like Day of the Dead and so forth, but we're not teaching them all the stories of that person. And so that I think has been one thing that I would recommend most folks, that when you're contracting with a teaching artist, try to find out a little bit about their history and introduce them to the kids as such. So my questions for you and me: what have we done to center Latino children's culture that isn't tied to a holiday? And not to assume that Latinx kids know about Dia de los Muertos. Ask them first before a class. You might be missing a point of empowering them. Take time to know your Latinx students. One day they might grow up and be here in front of us teaching like I am. The question: besides the Hispanic heritage, what other time of the year can we celebrate Latinx culture or Latino culture? And as you can see, I go back and forth from Latino to Latinx. Some of some of our Latino children's parents are coming from a generation that don't know what Latinx means. That might be something very new for them. So they might not want to be identified that way. And so we should respect that as well. But just for you guys to know, Latinx, and I think most of us here might know that already, being in a town like Madison, Wisconsin. But Latinx is more of an inclusionary way of including both non-binary and binary LGBTQ population. And so that came back from academia. But the reason why I was asking these questions is because I oftentimes would hear from other students that this was the only time of year that they're invited into this as an expert. And so before we put them on the spot in that moment, it's probably best to ask them. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to ask. So my alternative to Dia de los Muertos has been Dia de los Niños, as it's known here in the United States. It was a nationally recognized initiative that emphasizes the importance of literacy for all children from all backgrounds. It is a daily commitment to linking children and their families to diverse books, languages, and cultures. And so this is this day, Dia del Niño, is celebrated mainly in April here in the United States, although it is recognized in many different parts and different times of the year. I do believe that in Mexico, in the United States, there's actually another holiday called Children's Day, which is celebrated the second Sunday in June. But Dia, I should mention, was started by Pat Mora and the American Library Association. And a couple fun facts to know about Dia del Niño is that the first one was inducted in April 30th, 1925 besides Mexico, there's other Latin countries that celebrate this day: Colombia, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, just to name a few. Kids do not get to skip school this day. You can tell them that. This is what I've I've asked around. No, sorry guys, you don't get to skip school on this day. But they have a really awesome campaign online from the American Library Association. So I encourage you guys to check it out. There you have tons of activities, even maps where they tell you where else it's being celebrated too. And so some of the activities that I've gone in to teach the children has been like a slideshow on one child hero. Okay, that they've researched, that you've researched previously. Malala has been very important in around second and third grade curriculum lately, and I think it still continues to be taught. Her book, Malala's book, still continues to be taught in schools, and so take someone like that, or other ones. There's so many children heroes nationally that it's really amazing. You can really pick who you'd want to just rediscover with the children that day. And it's a part that you can also read about them too. And one of the activities that I have here suggested is like making them into an avatar, a 3D object, a poem, or a stick figure. The challenge is, what I always tell them is like, what would they say about the United States today? So if we're talking about historical children heroes, either in any kind of movement internationally, I ask them, what do you think they would say about us today? That's been my kind of the challenge. And usually I focus on historical children figures who have passed and from, who are part of different movements, but historically tied. So another challenge is reading 10 bilingual picture books in groups, have them create a new multilingual character. So I really like this one because all the books I choose are really character driven. So I ask them to bring out their new character, but I want them to speak another language. And so that's the challenge there for them. And so here are some of the ones that I've reviewed over the years. So Emma Teyayuka, also known as Emma Beatriz Teyayuka, was an American labor leader, union organizer, and educator. She was best known for organizing Mexican workers in Texas during the 1930s, especially in the San Antonio pecan sheller strike. And there's a picture book about her as well that I teach usually with the students. It's called "It's Not Fair." What I love about her story is that she's fairly young when she started her uprising, her movement. She was only like 15, 16 years old when she started her movement, and she became, her first arrest was when she was 16 years old. And so that she's like this all like this an unknown sheer hero of Latinas. And then if you see here, I put los niños héroes o los cadetes, the six cadets. They were, the story goes is that these six cadets, they're in Mexico City. There's a monument built for them in Mexico City. They were during the invasion of the United States into Mexico in 1847. They protected this castle called Chapultepec. And so in the classroom, I usually will show them, pictures of Chapultepec, the palace. It's very elegant, and then I'll show them about these young soldiers that protected the palace that day and what their sacrifice meant to their country. Some people, it's historical. It is what happened. Here are some other resources here that I was talking to you guys about Dia at the American Library Association. And so why I offer both of these stories, both of these types of classroom activities and talks over the years is like, because I feel like it brings such a deep empathy for the student's family, even though that they have never met them, they know their stories, right? We have these deep moments during the circle time, respects from all stories, from like fish to human shootings to violence. A lot of things like that come out. and I meet them with a lot of empathy and heart, and my hat's off to the teachers who have let me be in their classrooms to talk about such delicate subjects, because there are delicate subjects to have in front of, and especially with someone that you haven't met. So we create this altar with them, and throughout that, we're going through social emotional learning, like I said earlier, all those steps that we go with the kids through that. And then to come to this part when we actually start talking about that, it's definitely, it takes time, but you grow that compassionate heart throughout the process, and it's amazing to see it at the end. And kids love it, and they want to do it again. They're like, "Can we do this again next year?" A lot of them will ask their teachers if they can have that time, and or the teachers later on will tell me, we've continued talking about death because of what you've said, and this, so it's interesting how that conversation continues on after having this type of a way of honoring our past and our families. So yeah, that's been kind of my experience with both of those, with both Day of the Dead and Dia de los Niños. For Day of the Dead, for older students, what I have done over the years to get them to this emotional art has been writing calaveritas, like poemas that kind of make fun of political figures or entertainment or whoever, or the rich, or anybody who's doing malice and in joke. So we'll poke fun, and kind of also poke fun at what's really happening in the world, and make these little poems in Spanish. So if they're in Spanish classes, which is kind of most typically how I see students in middle grade and high school, I'll often work with a Spanish teacher, and we'll introduce them. We'll go through a lot of stories in Spanish, and then come up with this exercise. And everything has line paper. We have a couple lines and examples that we go through to teach the students how to rhyme in Spanish, and how to make this. It's almost like a haiku. It's an epitaph in Spanish. But it's supposed to be funny as well, and it's supposed to make fun of the person who is dead. I know it's very silly, but it does draw students to kind of have more of a critical eye towards current events. And so thank you so very much for having me here today. And I welcome you to continue learning about what I do through Facebook, called Libros, for our kids community. It's a page that I created so that you can, where I share out other picture books, other movements, what people are doing around the United States for Dia de los Muertos.
Thank you, Araceli. If you'd like, you could stop sharing your screen. And I invite participants to go into gallery view, and we can have a discussion. You can ask some of those